The morning Atlas Corporate Asset Administration fell apart took 11 minutes from start to finish, and I was the only person in the building who knew it was coming. Because I had been writing things down for almost 3 years, ever since I first heard Lexington Price explain a decision by saying his uncle owned the company, as if that were a job title rather than a relationship. It happened on a Tuesday in the 14th floor systems office on a gray Charlotte morning. Lexington came through the door without knocking, tie loose, holding a termination notice he'd clearly printed himself. "I'm the top executive now," he announced, loud enough that 2 analysts in the next cubicle looked up. "Surrender your access codes," Lexington said with rehearsed pride. I didn't argue. I opened my desk drawer, took out the 2 security tokens tied to my administrator credentials, and set them on the desk. "Of course," I said calmly. "I'll need a few minutes to log my handoff notes if that's all right," I added. He didn't answer. He was already telling the analysts he'd be handling system access personally. I logged the handoff, every line. Then I packed my desk into a single box and went home. 4 months later, an auditor from the state's Division of Financial Asset Oversight sat across from Lexington Price in that same office. A stack of spreadsheets opened between them. The spreadsheets traced every system access change, every override, every after-hours transfer, back to credentials that had been quietly logging everything. The auditor looked up. "You terminated him and he voluntarily returned the codes," she said slowly with measured disbelief. Lexington didn't answer right away. For the first time in 6 years, he had nothing rehearsed to say. I wasn't in that room, but I knew it was happening. I'd known for almost 3 years exactly how this would end, not because I planned it, but because I had simply never stopped writing things down. This is corporate vault, stories about what happens when a pattern runs unchecked for years inside a company, right up until it meets a record nobody knew existed. My name is Holden Drake, and for 22 years I worked as a senior systems access administrator at Atlas Corporate Asset Administration, the person responsible for who could open what, on which servers, at what hours, and why. My father ran a small auto parts supply business outside Greensboro for almost 30 years. He kept everything in green ledger books, every invoice, every late payment, every verbal promise a customer made. I asked him once when I was 12 why he bothered writing down things people said out loud. "Because in 6 months," he said quietly, "they won't remember saying it, and I will," my father added with certainty. That's the whole reason. Not suspicion, not strategy, just a habit I picked up because someone close to me did it that way. I carried that habit into Atlas in 2004 and never thought much about it again, until Lexington Price became my direct supervisor's supervisor. We met for the first time in a conference room on the 14th floor. He found my name on a printout, looked up, and smiled. "Systems access guy," he said casually. "Good. I'm going to need somebody who can move fast and not make a big deal out of every little request. Some of the old-timers here treat every form like it's a federal case," Lexington said dismissively. "I can do that," I said evenly. "Just to make sure I understand, when you say requests, are we talking about standard provisioning or after-hours changes too?" I asked. "Whatever I need whenever I need it," he said, still smiling. "I've been around this place my whole life. I know how it runs better than the people who wrote the manual," Lexington said with casual arrogance. I didn't know that afternoon that I just heard the first sentence of something. I only knew that, whatever I need, whenever I need it, was strange for a person to say to the one employee whose entire job was making sure that wasn't how access worked. I wrote it down anyway. The first thing I wrote down about Lexington Price that actually mattered happened on a Thursday afternoon in his 6th week as my supervisor's supervisor. Atlas had a standing policy that any vendor portal access above standard read-only level required a change control ticket, approved in advance, with documented business justification. I'd processed hundreds of these tickets. They were routine. Lexington called me directly that afternoon, skipping the ticket system. "I need admin-level portal access for Brindlewood Supply set up by end of day," he said briskly. "Don't worry about the change control form. I'll square it with compliance later. This is time-sensitive," Lexington said dismissively. "Just to confirm I have this right," I said carefully. You're asking for admin-level access to the Brindlewood account, granted today, outside the standard change window, and the retroactive ticket will follow from your office, I asked. Exactly, you're overthinking it. I've been doing this 20 years, Drake. Half these rules exist for people who don't know what they're doing. I do, Lexington said with impatient confidence. Understood. I'll set it up and send a confirmation email so we both have a record of the request and the timing, I said professionally. Sure, whatever makes you happy, Lexington said absently. I set up the access. It took 4 minutes. Then I wrote a short email confirming the date, time, account name, and the fact that the change control ticket would follow retroactively per his instruction. I sent it to him with myself copied. He never replied. The retroactive ticket never came. I moved the confirmation email into a folder on my personal drive, not the shared one, labeled with nothing more than the date. I told myself it was just good practice. The folder on my personal drive had 11 entries when I had the conversation that changed how I thought about what I was doing. It was a Friday, late, and I was the last person on the 14th floor besides Imogen Reyes, a compliance analyst 2 departments over. She found me in the break room. Can I ask you something, Drake? Off the record, Imogen said carefully. Sure, I replied. Did Lexington ever call you directly for an access change, skip the ticket, tell you he'd handle the paperwork after? Imogen asked pointedly. I kept my voice even. He's called with a few time-sensitive requests, yeah. Why? I asked cautiously. Because 2 years ago I flagged something almost exactly like that. A vendor account, Castellan Holdings, got elevated access with no change control ticket on file. I brought it to my director. I even brought it to compliance leadership, Imogen said with bitter amusement. You know what happened? Imogen asked. What happened? I asked quietly. Nothing, literally nothing. I got a meeting where someone explained to me very kindly that Lexington moves fast and that the paperwork catches up eventually. 2 weeks later, there was a note in my file about escalation judgment. Not a write-up. Just a note, the kind that doesn't go away, Imogen said with resignation. I raised this 2 years ago, she said, and for the first time her voice lost its dry edge. Nothing happened. You learn to stop expecting anything. You keep your head down, do your job, and stop being the person who notices things out loud. Because being that person costs you, and it doesn't fix anything, Imogen said wearily. That sounds like it cost you something, I said gently. It cost me a promotion I was up for the following year, officially unrelated. Unofficially, Imogen said, then shrugged. Anyway, I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe because you're the only person here I've ever seen actually read the fine print on anything, Imogen added quietly. I appreciate you telling me, I said sincerely. For what it's worth, I added. We finished cleaning the break room and went home. I added a new entry that night, not about Lexington, but about Imogen. The date, the name Castellan Holdings, and 4 words, raised 2 years ago. What I understood was the difference between what she'd done and what I was doing. She'd said something out loud to people whose job it was to listen, and it had cost her something real while changing nothing. I hadn't said anything to anyone. I just kept writing things down, quietly, the way my father had. The folder had a name by the spring of the following year. I'd started calling it the Brindlewood file, even though by then it held records from 11 different vendor accounts. What changed that spring was that I met someone the pattern had actually hurt. Her name was Natalie Hall, and she worked 2 floors down in vendor relations. I met her at a mandatory training session on data handling procedures, and we ended up at the same table. She recognized my name from email signatures. You're the one who sent that confirmation email about Brindlewood Supply, Natalie said with recognition. Last year, I remember because I had to deal with the fallout, Natalie said quietly. What fallout? I asked with concern. Brindlewood's contract got terminated for cause about 4 months after that access change, Natalie explained. Their finance team found a transfer authorization on their account that none of their people had submitted. They were furious, rightly. It took me 3 weeks to smooth it over enough that they didn't go to the state with a complaint, Natalie said, keeping her voice low. Officially, it was logged as a system error during a permissions migration. I wrote that report myself. I didn't believe it when I wrote it, Natalie said with regret. Why didn't you push back on the wording? I asked carefully. because the wording came down from Lexington's office, and the alternative was unauthorized access by Atlas personnel. And I didn't have anything to point to that would make that version stick. So I wrote the version that wouldn't get me in trouble, and Brindlewood lost a contract they'd had with Atlas for 9 years, and 3 of their employees got laid off. I know that because I called their office manager afterward just to apologize, not officially, just personally, Natalie said with lingering guilt. That sounds like it stayed with you, I said gently. It did, it still does, Natalie said seriously. I'm not saying anything happened the way I think it happened. I'm just saying if you ever do have a record of how that access actually got set up, and when, I'd want you to know it would matter to more than just an audit. There were real people on the other end of that system error, Natalie said meaningfully. I told her I understood. I didn't tell her about the folder. I didn't tell her about the confirmation email that contradicted the entire premise of the report she'd been told to write. That night I added Natalie's name to the file, along with the date of our conversation and 3 words. Brindlewood, 3 jobs. By the 3rd year, the Brindlewood file had grown into a second, smaller version of my actual job. One nobody had assigned me, that I did after 6 in the evening when the floor had emptied out. I'd gotten comfortable with it, comfortable enough to get careless exactly once. It happened during a routine quarterly access review. Lexington sat at the head of the conference table scrolling through his phone, while I walked through a list of accounts with elevated permissions. I'd printed a secondary list for myself, a cross-reference of account names against dates. I'd set it on top of my folder, half-covered, when Lexington's chair scraped back. He leaned over for coffee, and his eyes passed across the printout for maybe 2 seconds. "What's that one?" he asked curiously, nodding at the page. "Looks different from the others," Lexington said with mild interest. My pulse did something I didn't let reach my face. The page had 4 account names, each with a date, and one was the Brindlewood entry from 3 years earlier, tied directly to him. "Just my own working notes," I said smoothly, sliding the main list to cover it. "I keep a personal cross-reference for recertification timing, helps me track which accounts are coming due for review. Saves me rerunning the report every quarter," I explained calmly. "Huh," Lexington said with mild appreciation. "You're more organized than half the compliance department, you know that?" Lexington said approvingly. "I just don't like surprises in an audit," I said evenly. "Easier to keep track as I go than to reconstruct it later," I added. "Smart," Lexington said, already looking back at his phone. The meeting moved on. Within 30 seconds it was forgotten by everyone except me and possibly Imogen, 2 seats down, who I noticed had glanced at the printout, then at me, then back at her notes and said nothing. That weekend, I rebuilt the entire filing system from scratch, moved everything off a personal drive that lived on Atlas hardware, onto an external drive that never connected to any Atlas network, encrypted, kept in a fireproof box that had belonged to my father. 3 years of quiet documentation had almost ended over a cup of coffee and 2 seconds of curiosity. By the 4th year, Lexington had stopped pretending the change control process applied to him. The shift was gradual, but I had 4 years of dated entries, and against that backdrop, the change was impossible to miss. It showed up most clearly in October in the system's office with the door open. He was on his way out for the day, jacket already on, when he stopped at my desk. "I need you to set up remote portal access for an account under Holden Capital Advisors," he said casually. "Tonight, if you can. I'm meeting with them this weekend, and I want to be able to pull their position data from my laptop," Lexington said matter-of-factly. "Holden Capital Advisors," I repeated carefully. "I don't have that listed as an existing Atlas client account. Is this a new relationship, or is it associated with an existing one under a different name?" I asked. It's a personal thing. A side arrangement. Nothing that touches Atlas's books directly, but I need to be able to see their numbers when I'm talking to them, and our system's the easiest way to do that," Lexington said lightly. "It's not a big deal. I've been doing this for years. Half the relationships in this building started as personal arrangements before they were anything else," Lexington said dismissively. "Just to make sure I have this right, you're asking me to create system access to Atlas's portal infrastructure for an account that isn't an Atlas client, for your personal use, outside business hours with no compliance review," I said slowly. When you say it like that, it sounds worse than it is, Lexington said with uneasy laughter. Look, I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. I'm asking you to do your job a little faster than usual, the way you've done it plenty of times before. Don't make this into something it isn't, Lexington said with growing irritation. I'll need a few minutes, I said calmly. I want to make sure whatever I set up doesn't create a compliance flag that comes back to either of us later, I said carefully. Fine, whatever. Just have it ready before I leave, Lexington said impatiently. I didn't set it up that night. I told him an hour later that the access required a server-side configuration I couldn't complete until the following morning. What I actually did with that hour was write down the entire conversation, as close to verbatim as I could manage, the phrase, personal arrangement. The phrase, half the relationships in this building started as personal arrangements. And the name Havorson Capital Advisors, which I cross-referenced that night and found nowhere in Atlas's client registry. The next morning, I set up a narrow, read-only credential, nothing close to what he'd asked for, and told him compliance had flagged the broader request automatically, and this was the version that would clear without triggering a review. This'll work, Lexington said dismissively, barely glancing at it. See, wasn't that hard, Lexington said with satisfaction. He never asked why it had taken until morning. That night I added the entry. Havorson Capital Advisors, no Atlas record, personal arrangement. Read-only granted, broader request declined via automated flag. The 5th year brought a new compliance officer to Atlas, a transfer from the regional office named Chloe Vance, who had the habit of reading things before signing them. She'd been in the role about 6 weeks when she stopped by the systems office on a Monday morning with a printout. Quick question, Chloe said professionally. I'm doing a routine review of read-only credentials issued outside the standard provisioning queue. There's one tied to an account called Havorson Capital Advisors. It's not in our client registry. Do you know what that's connected to? Chloe asked with careful curiosity. I can tell you what I have on record, I said carefully. It was issued as a narrow read-only credential about 8 months ago. The request came through as a time-sensitive exception. I don't have visibility into what the account itself is used for outside our system. That would be outside my role, I explained. 8 months read-only, and it's still active, Chloe said thoughtfully. Just seems like an odd one to leave open this long without a recertification note attached, Chloe observed. It would have come up in this quarter's recertification cycle, I said. I can flag it for review now if that's useful, I offered. That'd be great, thanks, Drake, Chloe said appreciatively. She left. I flagged it through the proper channel, the one that generated a time-stamped record, the one Lexington had stopped checking years earlier. 3 days later, Lexington found me in the hallway near the elevators. Chloe Vance is asking about Havorson, he said tensely. What did you tell her? Lexington demanded. Exactly what's on file, I said evenly. That a read-only credential was issued as a time-sensitive exception 8 months ago, and that it came up for recertification this cycle, so I flagged it per standard process, I explained calmly. You didn't need to flag it. You could have just handled it, Lexington said with restrained frustration. The flag is automatic once a credential crosses the recertification threshold, I said matter-of-factly. I don't have the ability to suppress it without leaving a separate record of having done so. I figured you'd rather I not create that record, I said reasonably. He looked at me for a moment longer than the conversation required. Right, Lexington said finally with forced calm. Yeah, good call, Lexington said uncomfortably. He walked off, and for the first time, I noticed he didn't look entirely like a man who'd been doing this for 20 years without a problem. That night I wrote down the date, Chloe's question, my answer, and Lexington's reaction, 5 words, no more. Asked what I'd told her. The recertification flag on Havorson Capital Advisors took 11 weeks to turn into anything. 11 weeks after Chloe Vance's question in the hallway, Havorson Capital Advisors stopped being a line item and became the subject of an actual finding. I found out because Chloe came to my desk again, this time with 2 other people I didn't recognize. Drake, this is Felix Marrow and Abigail Vance from the Regional Compliance Office, Chloe said formally. They're looking into an account discrepancy that touches the Havorson credential, among a few others. We're going to need some help reconstructing access history. Is that something you can assist with? Chloe asked professionally. Of course, I said calmly. What's the scope, a specific account or a broader window? I asked. Felix Merrow answered. We're conducting a standard review of the department's access provisioning practices over the last several years. Havorson is one account among several we're looking at. Nothing's been determined yet. We're just establishing the timeline, Felix said neutrally. I can pull system logs going back as far as our retention policy allows, I said. That's typically 36 months on the primary servers. Though I should note that while the primary server logs hard limit at 36 months per our retention policy, I maintain a localized, encrypted personal historical cache for my own administrative continuity tracking, essentially working notes with extended timestamps. That personal archive bridges the full 5.5-year window. If that level of detail would be useful to your review, I clarified. 36 months from the servers would help, Abigail said thoughtfully. Though if there's anything informal, notes, emails, anything outside the system logs that might fill gaps, that's often where the real picture comes together, Abigail said meaningfully. I felt the question underneath the question. I'd spent 5 years preparing for a moment that might never come, and now 3 people were standing at my desk, asking, without quite asking, whether anything like that existed. I'll go through what I have, I said steadily. If there's anything relevant, I'll bring it to you, I said. Felix nodded. Appreciate it. We'll be set up in the 4th floor conference room for the next few weeks if anything comes to mind, Felix said with professional courtesy. They left. Chloe lingered a moment longer than the others. Drake, Chloe said quietly, whatever you have, even if it doesn't feel like much, bring it. I have a feeling not much is going to turn out to be more than anyone expects, Chloe said with meaningful emphasis. I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about Imogen, 2 years before Havorson existed, sitting in a meeting where someone explained to her that paperwork catches up eventually. I was thinking about Natalie and the phone call she'd made to apologize for something that wasn't hers to apologize for. That afternoon, for the first time, the word someday had a date on it. I went home that night and opened the fireproof box for the first time with the intention of taking something out of it, rather than putting something in. It took 2 days to decide what bring it actually meant. What took 2 days was understanding that once you hand something like that to someone else, it stops being yours. I'd kept it private for 5 years specifically, because privacy was the only thing that had kept it safe. On the 3rd morning, I printed a single index, not the documents themselves, just a list dated entry by entry of what existed and when each item had been created, and brought it to the 4th floor conference room. Felix Merrow looked at the index for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked up. This goes back 5 years, Felix said with restrained surprise. Closer to 5.5, I said calmly. I can have copies of everything on this list to you by end of day if that's useful, I offered. Yes, that would be extremely useful. Drake, do you understand what's on the Havorson account? Felix asked seriously. I don't actually, I said honestly. I only know what I documented at the time it was requested, I explained. Havorson Capital Advisors doesn't exist, Abigail said quietly. Not as a registered entity, not anywhere. The access credential you described setting up has been used intermittently for 2.5 years to view position data on 11 Atlas client accounts. Accounts Lexington Price has no professional relationship to. We've been trying to establish since when and by whom. You just answered both, Abigail said with measured gravity. I didn't say anything for a moment. I'd known the folder might matter someday. I hadn't let myself imagine it would answer a question that big, that fast. That afternoon, I delivered copies of everything, 5.5 years, organized by date, exactly as it had sat in the fireproof box. Chloe walked me to the elevator afterward. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Did anyone ask you to keep these records? Were you told to by anyone at any point? Chloe asked directly. No, I said simply. Nobody asked, it's how I've always done things. My father kept records of every conversation he had in his business. I think I just never stopped, I explained. That's either the most boring superpower I've ever heard of or the most useful one. I genuinely can't decide, Chloe said with bemused respect. Lexington heard about the documentation 2 days later. He came to my desk that afternoon, and for the first time in 6 years, he didn't sit on the edge of it. "I heard you handed over 5 years of files," Lexington said with lowered voice. "Is that true?" Lexington asked tensely. "I provided documentation that compliance requested as part of their review," I said evenly. "You've been keeping a file on me for 5 years," Lexington said slowly. "That's Drake, that's not normal, that's not what employees do. People are going to ask why you were doing that. People are going to ask what kind of person spends 5 years writing down everything their boss says. Just waiting," Lexington said with barely controlled anger. "I wasn't waiting for anything," I said calmly. "I document access changes. I've done it since before you were my supervisor. The dates on those records go back further than you'd probably guess to vendor accounts that have nothing to do with you at all," I explained matter-of-factly. "That's not going to matter once this gets in front of the board. You know how this looks, right? It looks obsessive. It looks like someone with a grudge built a case over half a decade. That's not going to play well for you either," Lexington said defensively. "I understand that's a concern," I said professionally. "I'd encourage you to raise it with compliance directly. I'm not in a position to characterize my own records. That's their job now, not mine," I said without emotion. He stood there a moment longer, and I watched him try on 3 or 4 different things to say and discard each one. 6 years of "I've been doing this for 20 years" had never required him to argue with a calm person holding dates, and he didn't seem to have anything built for that. "This isn't over," Lexington said finally with hollow threat. He walked away, which, of everything he'd said to me in 6 years, was the first sentence I didn't bother writing down. Everyone in the hallway had heard it. That night I sat with what he'd said about how it looked. He wasn't entirely wrong. 5 years of one person quietly recording everything a colleague said does look strange, out of context. And for an hour, I let myself feel the weight of that, the version of this where the records were read not as a record of his behavior, but as a record of mine. It passed because the dates didn't change depending on who was looking at them, and because I'd never written down a single thing that wasn't true. The board investigation took 6 weeks and ended the way these things actually end. Not with a public announcement, but with a 1-paragraph internal memo stating that Lexington Price had stepped down from his role at Atlas to pursue other opportunities, effective immediately, and that Atlas was implementing enhanced access control protocols across all departments. The Havorson accounts were quietly unwound. 3 of the 11 affected clients received restitution payments. Brindlewood Supply was not one of the 11 that had happened too long ago. Outside any window the investigation covered. But Chloe told me off the record that the report Natalie Hall had been told to write 4 years earlier had been pulled and re-reviewed as part of the broader pattern, and that Natalie had finally been told in writing that the system error hadn't been hers. I saw Natalie in the cafeteria a few weeks after that. She sat down across from me without asking. "I heard," Natalie said quietly. "About the report, about all of it actually word travels," Natalie said. She turned her coffee cup slowly on the table, not quite looking at me. "I spent 4 years thinking I'd written something untrue and just had to live with it. Turns out I had written something untrue. I just didn't write the lie part," Natalie said with bitter clarity. "You wrote what you were told to write," I said gently. "That's a different thing than lying," I said. "Maybe," Natalie said thoughtfully. She finally looked up. "I don't know what to say to you exactly. Thank you feels wrong, you didn't do this for me. But somebody was paying attention the whole time I thought nobody was, and that matters. It matters more than I expected it to," Natalie said with quiet gratitude. "It mattered that you told me about it," I said sincerely. "I didn't know what Brindlewood cost anyone until you told me. The dates don't mean anything without that part," I said. She nodded, and we sat for a while without saying much else, which was its own kind of conversation. I still work at Atlas. The systems office looks the same as it did 6 years ago, except that change control tickets now require 2 signatures for anything above standard provisioning, and quarterly access reviews are conducted by a rotating team. Chloe calls these boring fixes. She's right. They are boring. They're also the kind of thing that 6 years ago didn't exist and might have stopped all of this before it started if they had. I think about the fireproof box sometimes, not as a weapon, and not as a trophy, It sits in the same closet it always sat in, mostly empty now, because most of what was in it eventually became part of someone else's official record, which is where it belonged all along. I kept one thing back. My father's ledgers, the originals, the ones that taught me before I understood what I was being taught, that the only thing that outlasts a conversation is whatever someone bothered to write down about it afterward. Nobody asked me to be the person who did that. I didn't choose it exactly either, not the way people choose things on purpose. It was just a habit that happened to be standing in the right place when the building needed it. If there's anything worth saying about 5.5 years of writing things down, it's this. Attention is not a strategy, and it doesn't feel like one while you're paying it. It only looks like one afterward to everyone who wasn't. This has been Corporate Vault. If stories like this one, about the long, quiet distance between when something starts and when it's finally addressed, are worth your time, we're still working toward 1,000 subscribers, and every one of you helps these stories find the people who need to hear that paying attention is never wasted.